Hello, welcome to SquashWarp in Kerbal Space Program. This is episode 13, and today we're watching a nice sunrise over Kerbin as we wait for the launch pad to become ready for our next big mission into space. We've been setting up a 7 Kerbin Day launch window, just to pay homage to the real world concern of, having to spend time actually building things before you can put them on the launch pad. But here we have the Chameleon Automated Transfer Vehicle. You may recognize that launch stage. We had a bit of a messy launch there. We did not have everything throttled up appropriately when we disengaged the launch clamps, dropped down onto the engine bell before rising back up and then kind of getting caught on the launch clamps. But in any case, the ship's durable. We've used it multiple times. That's the Amazon lifter that we initially designed for our manned moon mission. And today we are putting up into orbit an automated spacecraft based on real-world designs that service the International Space Station. The ATV and the Progress shuttle bring supplies and important consumables to the space station. And in our universe, we just have a probe core hidden inside the structure, and then a couple of monopropellant tanks, a big fuel tank, and some supplies. We're sending it up to the Dol Space Station, and it's partly for the space station, but we are also going to dock it with the station in preparation for receiving the Ganji spacecraft, which will be coming back from Minmus shortly. And after deploying those fairings, we discover that, yes, we forgot a reaction wheel, or we thought we weren't going to need one. In other words, I try to save part count, especially when I'm sending something up to the space station, and we needed the RCS thrusters on the sides there. So they're going to serve as attitude control because the little probe core hidden inside one of those structural pieces really provides pretty meager torque. Going to circularize on our Poodle engine. And we do a bunch of rendezvous maneuvers and, matching inclinations, things like that, but I'm going to cut all of that out and skip us ahead to when we are approaching the station. As usual, I always enjoy docking procedures, especially with such a pretty little base. Wow, it's a bit of a transient base. When you accelerate time, it jumps around. And the modular rocket system decoupler has some solid rocket boosters in it. So you decouple and the previous stage goes flying backwards, which we used in this case to deorbit the circularizing stage once we had used it up. Skipping ahead in the docking procedure, it's just lots of time accelerating and aligning things. This is our first automated docking in this particular save. For me, it doesn't matter, but for the Kerbals, it matters. And then the sun sets, so we got it done just barely in time. That means it's time to send Wiltrid Kerman out. We've got a scaled-down version of the Kerbal Inventory System container there, the stackable container that goes in the parts. And inside is a non-broken radiator, so we can finally have that second radiator match up. And here I'm just trying to get it in exactly the same spot on the other side of the window. It's not perfect, but it's very close, and it continues to improve the aesthetics of the space station that is designed half for functionality and half for aesthetics anyway. The scientists are, of course, still working away in the lab. And over at the Ganji spacecraft, the one with only one solar panel now, Ribley is sorry, I cut out a pretty significant correction burn. I had been looking ahead at the orbit and discovered that our close moon flyby wasn't just putting us in an orbit that would hit Kerbin, which we figured we could correct for. It was actually putting us in a trajectory that was retrograde by like 170 degrees compared to the space station, and that's just more work than we need to do do our rendezvous later. Flying in and reaching the moon's sphere of influence. And now we can do a bunch of science, which I, of course, am going to edit out again because it's all the same. We do the science, we pick it up, we store it in various containers, we do it over again and repeat. And then we just have to wait for them to fly out of the moon's sphere of influence. But in the meantime, we actually end up with yet another launch window. Now you'll notice that there was no spaceplane launch in here. We didn't need to do one. Now listen to these engine sounds. And liftoff of Anole 1, a unmanned probe to explore our nearest celestial neighbor that is not in orbit of Kerbin. Now I played that in regular time so we could get to hear those awesome KW rocketry sound effects. As I was saying, this is a space probe that we are sending to Eve. The thing about Eve is that it is not at all in the right place. But I was taking a look at the transfer window planner. Our next Eve window is for, like over a year. We missed the very first one, and then we got to wait. And I decided instead, the sooner the better. It turned out, looking at the numbers, the Delta V requirements are only going up from here until they start to get better in a long time. So we're going to go ahead and take this opportunity. Now, I've been waiting on a particular antenna part to unlock in Tier 7, and had completely missed the antenna part that I had already unlocked in Tier 6 that gives us enough range to do Eve and Moho missions with relative ease, and I just completely missed it. I unlocked it and I didn't even notice it. So we slapped a couple of those on the spacecraft, and we're just gonna circularize up here, waiting for fairing deployment. Very nice. I think there's something a little bit wrong with the fairing deployment, though. I know that, I'm a fan of the kind of the clamshell opening effect, but it's not just that. I feel like they get jettisoned out to the side, and then even though we're not in the atmosphere, there seems to be a weird force on them where they open and then they close they stay at a fixed distance apart as the spacecraft flies out from them. Maybe it's just because we run away from them just as quickly, but it's probably just something I need to fiddle around with in my mod installation here. And now we are setting up our Eve encounter, but I cut out most of those maneuver node editing because it takes me a while. It's an unusual transfer. We have to kind of swing down closer to Moho's orbit and then come back up. We'll meet it when it's gone like more than halfway around its orbit, so it's going to be quite a long wait for the spacecraft. But it will still be less time to wait than waiting for the actual transfer window for a Hohmann transfer. We're using this, I'm pretty sure it's B9 part, this low-profile lander engine that's based on the LV909, but it's 2.5 meters, and it has more thrust, just barely lower specific impulse, and a very nice blue effect in the back. Much of the spacecraft itself is made from parts from Modular Rocket Systems Light, the little cargo bay parts and those 0.625 meter parts that are on either side that contain most of the fuel. Those two antennas should give us about 60% additional antenna power. That doesn't translate to 60% more range, but it will boost our range a little bit and hopefully ensure that we get connectivity all the way around Eve's orbit, or at least far enough for us to care. We should be able to continue doing maneuvers by doing prograde, retrograde holds, and Z and X buttons, even if we lose connectivity. But hopefully we won't have to wait too long. If we do lose connection, we want Kerbin to come back within range quickly so we can transmit our science. We've got a lot of science reports to do. Most of them are one-time use, but we'll make the best of it. And Ganges is doing one final correction burn as far as inclination goes for the space station. And then we skip ahead to our periaps burn. So where a normal capsule might be doing a re-entry coming back from Minmus, we are going to light up the LV909 engine, and everybody's going to look out the windows and see as beautiful Kerbin with the visual enhancements mod flies by at many kilometers a second. And I time accelerate through the maneuver. I love the way that it looks when you do the internal overlay. It's like there's a whole interior in there. It's only 3 parts, but it feels like it's a very full spacecraft as far as places to be. Partly helped, I think, by the fact that we're under capacity. We could fit 4 more Kerbals than we actually brought. But then we'd need more life support if we're going to go to Minmus. If we take this to the moon sometime, we could probably fill it up with Kerbals, but as it is, we want to stretch out life support. Anyway, coming into the Dol Guldur space station now, I set up a maneuver that was just for the purpose of giving us a burn time for that amount of delta V, based on the relative velocity at closest approach. So burning the engine until we bring that number down, and then we time accelerate, bring the number down, and just kind of zigzag in. At this point, Malfry and Frannis Kerman are total professionals. They've been to multiple biomes on Minmus. They spent a lot of time in the spacecraft. This is the first time, however, that they will see the space station, which is now shaping up to be something I'm quite proud of. I've built bigger stations, I've built stations with bigger parts, and I've built stations with much more storage capacity, but this thing is actually doing something useful for me in a way that I don't feel that I've achieved before with the space station, so I'm particularly pleased with it. We switch control over to the small inline clampetron that we recently attached to the side. We could go around the back and dock on the back of the ATV, but again, I like imagining that the Kerbals can somehow crawl between things. And we're going to see the interior view from the perspective of the Kerbals, looking out the window as the pilots do the docking. And the sun has set, but that is no deterrence for our Kerbal crew. We just need to reduce our closing speed for terminal approach. There's the radiators on the back, and captured. That was a particularly fun docking. Look at that, attached on the side of the node there. I love that kinds of things. We skip ahead to daylight so we can see what we're doing. And the station has kind of gradually drifted relative to the sun, and I'm just changing it back. And going to try using a feature in persistent rotation that I haven't tried before. I believe that what will happen is that that setting will enable the station to stay in this same orientation relative to the sunlight rather than to its orbit with Kerbin. Jedni Kerman needs to come out and grab a couple things out of the storage container in the automated transfer vehicle. And by doing so, he also performs a complete front loop, which is quite impressive to everyone on the station and all the Kerbals back home who perhaps are watching from some hidden camera. And of course what he's doing is he's replacing that broken solar panel. Ribley got excited, jumped up in the air, and smashed it off. So we've got a replacement that was sent up on the transfer vehicle. And that's not in the middle. Jedni feels he can do better. Yeah, that's good enough. There we go. And now we can put the broken one in this container on the station to be brought down to the surface, or can just live up there and get experimented on, I guess. I enjoy how useful using the V button to change the camera orientation. It's so useful when your Kerbal is not facing the ladder properly and is going to have a hard time grabbing onto it. You can just press V a couple times and it'll work itself out. So the station's now complete. There's 12 Kerbals on the station now, and it's completely over capacity. So that means it's time for some musical chairs. But using the Science Lab's level up function, we now have 2 level 2 pilots, 2 level 2 engineers, and 2 level 2 scientists. So Ribley, who's now extra special with his 2 stars by his name, has brought 1 set of the science into the lab, and he's going to increase the research speed with that extra star by a certain percentage, and then we process everything that can fit in the lab into data so that it can be processed into science. And by the time we're done with this, we're looking at a data rate of we've got about 10 science being generated per day, which is not bad. We end up actually eventually moving Ribley back into the Ganges and having Virulin come in. Virulin's gone to the moon and Minmus in very short order. It's time to give her a break. She can stay at home and do some of the research. Whereas Ribley gets to go back out into space because, of course, the Ganges has been all filled up from the transfer vehicle's fuel tank, the Chameleon's extra fuel tank. Matthew Kerman, one of our scientists that has been in the space station, is going to grab the other sets of science. And rather than putting them in the lab can store as many copies as you want of multiple things, but then you can't distinguish them. So I'm storing one copy in each of these crew cans, the crew can and the itinerant service container there. And she's going to join the research with Virulin, whereas everybody else is going to kind of sort themselves out. Going to send Dudrin and Wiltrid, as well as Stachel Kerman. And Frannis is going to get to fly again, because we want our level 2 pilot. Still can't do the maneuver node hold, which is the one I really want, but we'll have to send somebody out into a solar orbit before we get that. My feeling is that the Kerbal experience matters more at the higher level for pilots and engineers. Engineers can start to repair wheels and lander legs and things like that. It's the scientists that I want to level up first because we can get more science more quickly that way. Speaking of science, over here at Cooter 1, which has been in orbit of the moon, we have finished our multispectral scan. And likewise, we can hop over to the identical probe over at Minmus, which is done with its multispectral scan, and both of them can transmit some science back home to the expectant research labs back at R&D. And I experiment for a second with bringing one of these back. We don't actually have a multispectral scan of Kerbin yet. I mean, we don't really need it. But I set a little timer because I want to wait until these orbits are in the right phase to return to Kerbin. Meanwhile, life goes on at Dol Guldur Space Station. And Radrian Kerman is getting ready to transfer important cargo from the storage containers on the space station to the Ganges spacecraft. So moving some containers around, and actually we're going to even take this docking port off entirely and leave it at the space station. We'll save a little bit of mass, but we're going to add a container that's much heavier. It just gives us a place to stick this here. Yeah, there we go. We can move that container off to the side, and then just got to fly back around it, grab that mostly empty container, get it out of the way, and then we can use the mount point, attach it there, move the storage container again, and now we just got to put a mount point on the spacecraft and attach the container to it. This container was brought up by the space plane, and it is full of parts from the Surface Experiments pack, which I've never used before. Well, we had that one mission. Ribley's first mission was him discovering that we didn't know how to use the Surface Experiment pack. So we're going to put that whole thing on top of our Minmus mission. And the Ganges is going to fly it out there. We're going to try to set something up. But that container is quite massive, so we're going to have smaller Delta V budgets on this mission than we had previously. And just double checking that there's nothing crucial in any of these containers that we wanted to bring to Minmus with us. And we're going to grab that mount, and we'll grab a spare radiator just in case. Between Kerbal Inventory System and the new behavior, I say new, the behavior of the stock science lab there, this space station is actually doing things for us. And normally I build space stations, and unless you get the station science pack, there's not really much to do with it other than make it big and slow down the computer with it. But I'm quite happy with this. We are going to transfer some fuel and life support primarily, set up tech life support to just move things out of the Chameleon transfer vehicle. And then we're ready to detach. And Ganges is about to go on its second mission. This is a reusable moon-going spacecraft. And of course, we misjudge our timing for our transfer to Minmus. But there we go. We set up. That's a pretty good burn. And now we're just going to fine tune this. Uh, Actually, getting more of our fine tuning from when we launch than from how hard we burn, or for how long we burn, which is always good. I always like to see what I can change with just when we start to maneuver, rather than using more fuel to get what I want. And we have two solar panels again. Everybody is ready to go. We realize that there's nobody in the pilot seat though, so Dudrid is gonna get in there. Dudrin, there we go. I knew that was wrong. And now it's funny, the whole thing now kind of looks like it has a hat. But our transfer burn is going to happen in the nighttime. And we've got quite a long burn, and in no small part this is because of the extra mass on top of the spacecraft, but also because the first time we went out to Minmus, if you remember, we were using a Poodle engine on a transfer stage that was full of fuel. So we've now got much smaller fuel margins than we did the last time. We're going to have to be very mindful because we need to be able to return and perform a complete braking maneuver at Kerbin Periaps in order to get into a position to dock with the space station again. The surface experiment packs, yeah, see, we've overburned, we've done something completely wrong. I'm not really sure how that happened. I think it's just because the burn took so long, we ended up with a totally different arrangement than what we had planned in the maneuver. There we go, now we're going to Minmus. The surface experiments can take a long time to run, but that's why we wanted to bring at least one level 2 Kerbal with us to pull that off. We'll probably have to leave them there and come back and get them. And speaking of things that are going to take a long time, here's our Anoli space probe, which is really quite a huge spacecraft. I mean, this thing is probably longer than Ganges, but you know, we're not going to run out of capability. We'll probably be able to orbit Eve and do various things and maybe land on Gilly with this thing. And while we're here, let's take a look at the Cooter 1 probe. So I've warped until our the line from a top view of our polar orbit is lining up with our prograde retrograde orbit of the moon. And after a lot of pulling on maneuver nodes, we get ready for an escape burn from the moon. And remember, this probe didn't just go to the moon and map it. This probe went to the moon, flew past it because we didn't have an alarm, went on this crazy orbit way over the plane, and then had to do an incredibly aggressive burn to get back into an intercept with the moon. Then got into a moon polar orbit, mapped the moon, and now it's going back to Kerbin, and we're actually going to perform another incredibly aggressive maneuver, changing our Kerbin inclination to about 88 degrees, close enough to 90. And then we'll need to brake at Periaps and then set up our 250 kilometer orbit. Also, we can just we can get a multispectral scan of Kerbin, find the biomes and the Easter eggs, without actually having to do a separate launch. If we really get desperate, if this thing doesn't work, we could always send something up in a space plane. But it's fun to see what I can get away with the tech that is already in orbit. Reusing spacecraft is definitely a fun challenge and a thing that is definitely done in real life as well. We swing over the back of Kerbin and immediately start running out of electricity, which concerns me somewhat. Really, I could just turn off the scanner. That would probably solve our problems. Perform our burn, and we're getting very low on fuel. And at first I'm going to set up a maneuver, but then we just warp to our apoaps. We want to try to lift up the periaps to 250 kilometers. And we'll do our burn at the top of apoaps here. And then it burns out. So that's as good as we're going to get. We're a little bit below 250, which means that the multispectral scanner is going to flash orange and green, which means it's lower than it wants to be. But we can see from the map that even though it's a very narrow slice that we're getting, we'll eventually map it, and it's for free. And while we are in orbit, we can just switch the camera over, get a look at everybody inside the space station. They all seem quite happy in there. And there's a bunch of science in the lab now, which we can transmit home. And we'll see how it is used in a future episode. Thank you for joining me for Squash Warp.